Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. As always, I'm your host Simon. This one, Unsolved. Another one of those ones where it's like, oh, we'll have a very unsatisfying ending. But I do seriously enjoy, speculating about them. In fact, the last one I recorded was Unsolved. I don't have it on my desk. I already cleared it away. I don't remember what it was. It might have been the last episode you heard. It might not. Anyway, this has been written by Danny. Thank you so much, Danny, for the show. If you're new here, never read this before. So let's just jump in, shall we? Jack the Ripper stalked the streets of Whitechapel in London in 1888 and is believed to have mutilated and murdered at least 5 women with connections to sex work without ever getting caught. This is not that story. Well, I'd be disappointed if it was, Danny, because we've definitely covered Jack the Ripper before. And I don't fancy sitting here for a good hour and a bit and reading about it again, because it is grim. Go back and listen to that episode if you want to. The saga of Jack the Ripper has got to be one of the most well-documented unsolved murder cases in history, and chances are that if you're a true crime buff, then you'll already be more than familiar with many of the grisly details. Oh, indeed. Details that will never leave my mind, Danny. But you might not be so familiar with the Atlanta Ripper, who seems to have slipped much further into the shadows than Jack could ever manage, to the point where he's become almost an forgotten figure. Oh, I thought you meant slip into the shadows, like as in he became even more evil than Jack the Ripper. I'm like, oh god! But no, he just managed to disappear, apparently. This is despite the fact that the Atlanta Ripper first struck only around 2 decades after Jack's killing spree came to an end. And it's despite the fact that the Atlanta Ripper was just as monstrous as his Whitechapel predecessor. We are going way back in time, though. When was Jack the Ripper? Turn of the century? Previous one? Yeah, I feel like I should know that. I feel like ends of 19th, right? In fact, he may even have been far worse. There are a potential 21 female victims whose barbaric deaths could be attributed to this monster, many of them murdered on consecutive Saturday nights. Right, you police couldn't stop him? Just go, ladies, don't go out on Saturdays, okay? That's the night that apparently he is free. This would make him a strong contender for the deadliest and most prolific serial killer of the era, if such a term had existed back then. Yet it took far longer for the police or the press to take any genuine interest in the ongoing murders, most of which were carried out between 1911 and 1912. I nailed it, did I? End of the 19th century for Jack the Ripper. And whilst Jack the Ripper had dominated the UK newspapers throughout his terrifying tenure, there's a crushingly bleak reason why anybody barely even seemed too bothered about the Atlanta Ripper. It's either sexism or racism, right? It's always, especially early 20th century, come on now. But was there really an entirely new face at work in Atlanta, or was this the most unwelcome return of a very familiar villain? Whilst the stomach-churning deaths of all of these women clearly took place, did the Atlanta Ripper ever really exist at all? And if he did, then has the identity of the elusive murderer who slipped through the cracks been staring at us in the face for well over a century? Long train running. Things were apparently looking up for Atlanta, Georgia, at the dawn of the 20th century. Following the devastation and destruction of the American Civil War, the city had sprung back to life and evolved into a major economic hub of the New South. The development of strategic railroad connections had helped to attract significant new investment, trade, and jobs, which in turn had helped attract a surge of new black migrants from Georgia and the broader Deep South seeking work. One such migrant was a man called Alonzo Herndon, who had been born into slavery in Walton County. While his family gained their freedom following the Civil War, when Alonzo was 7 years old, they entered freedom in destitution. A young Alonzo spent much of his childhood working as a sharecropper on a plantation and only ever received 1 year of schooling. By the time he was an adult, he was working as a farmhand and training as a barber in Atlanta. And it was there that things really began to look up for the young entrepreneur. At the turn of the 20th century, Alonzo Herndon owned several upmarket barbershops in Atlanta, which attracted VIP customers. Holy good for him. He later moved into real estate and was destined to become Atlanta's first ever black millionaire. God damn, a millionaire back in the 1920s or whenever this, 1911, 10s, early 20th century. That is a lot of money. Fair play to Alonzo. Whilst it's easy to reel off names of some of the tens of thousands of millionaires born into wealth, not much more than a handful were born into slavery. Oh, you bet. This is a remarkable success story. So it sounds as if life was pretty peachy for everyone in Atlanta, as people of different cultures and backgrounds came to work in harmony and forge a brighter future, whilst occasionally breaking out into spontaneous song and dance on the lively city streets that were paved with jelly babies. I guess there's a but coming, Danny. Or a however. Except, of course, that this is not a fairy tale, and life in Atlanta was nothing like this. Whilst things turned out mighty fine for Alonzo Herndon, his story was far from a typical case. Most black men earned a pittance working in factories if they were lucky, or working down sewers if they were slightly less fortunate. Most black women provided domestic services for wealthy white families, such as cooking, cleaning, and dealing with soiled underwear. It's very specific. After clocking off for the day, the workers would return to their modest homes in the rougher, overcrowded neighborhoods of Pittsburgh and Reynoldstown, where you'd be unlikely to spot a white face wandering through for a visit. Enforced racial segregation was in full swing in the southern United States during this period. Oh yeah, and for a long time after. Which meant that black folk couldn't drink in the same bars as white folk, or drink from the same water fountains, or get buried in the same cemeteries. They couldn't even use the same Bible in a courtroom. We're gonna get cooties, white guy. Black residents faced frequent discrimination from employers and the police. The majority of arrests in Atlanta in the early 20th century were made on the minority black population, who were often charged with the pettiest of offences, including wandering or strolling around in idleness. Hey, lazy bones, get in the back of the car! Further hostility came from the local press, which was largely responsible for stirring up the storm that led to the 1906 Atlanta race massacre. In September of that year, several local newspapers reported, without any credible substantiation, that 4 white women had been sexually assaulted by black men. It probably didn't help matters that at almost the exact same time Atlanta was hosting a stage production of the ludicrous 1905 toilet roll novel The Klansman, which depicted the Ku Klux Klan as chivalrous heroes. Which aged brilliantly. In furious response to the unfounded press reports, mobs of angry white men descended on the city over the course of 2 days to destroy the homes and businesses of black people. One of the very first targets was a luxurious barbershop owned by Alonzo Herndon. Black men and women were being thrown from trolley cars, assaulted with clubs, and pelted with stones, and it was reported that hundreds of black families fled Atlanta in fear. Of course they did, because they don't want to be attacked. Whilst the Georgia National Guard was called in to quell the riots, the comparison in arrests and deaths between the white thugs and the black targets, many of whom had armed themselves in defense, made for predictably grim reading. Approximately 70 white people were arrested, most of whom were released pretty quickly without consequence. It's like, oh, you're white, I didn't see you without my glasses on. Be free! 2 white people died. One of them was a woman who had experienced a heart attack from the shock of it all. In contrast, around 250 black people were arrested, whilst it's believed that somewhere between 25 to 40 black people were killed. Precise figures unknown, because we didn't bother counting. Now the past. And what did the serving mayor of Atlanta, the Democrat James G. Woodward, have to say during the height of the riots? He said this: "The best way to prevent a race riot depends entirely upon the cause. If your inquiry has anything to do with the present situation in Atlanta, then I would say the only remedy is to remove the cause. As long as the black brutes assault our white women, just so long will they be unceremoniously dealt with." Feel like I gotta say it again, but holy shit, the past. That's the mayor. Immediate consequences of the 1906 race massacre, which again we should emphasize was sparked by unfounded allegations in the press, included even stricter and more idiotic segregation laws and measures to impose even further restrictions on black voting. And all of this is tragically relevant because it was in this environment of tension, anger, and despair that the Atlanta Ripper first made his mark. I told you it's going to have something to do with racism, because it's Atlanta at the early 20th century, of course it is. I mean, you could make an argument for a lot of casual criminalists in the present day that there's going to be elements of racism. And this was 100-something years ago. And he appeared to have very specific targets in mind. Invisible touch. Now, before we go any further, I should point out that concrete details are often sparse in this case, particularly during the early incidents for which there is little in the way of official documentation, and press coverage was sparse and contradictory. Few newspapers tended to agree on the name of the victims or the circumstances of their deaths. Some victims were never identified at all, and it's difficult to even know for sure how long the reign of the Atlanta Ripper even lasted, as the potential list of victims is still contentious today. But we'll try to piece together as many pieces of the story as we can find from the limited information available, and I believe that a reasonably plausible starting point would be October the 3rd, 1910. All right then. Off we go. It was on this Monday, that the body of 23-year-old Maggie Brooks was first discovered near the Atlanta and West Point Railroad tracks, presumably having been murdered at some point over the weekend. Maggie had worked as a cook, and it's believed that she was targeted as she was making her way home from what turned out to be her final shift. She suffered from a fractured skull, having been beaten around the head with a rock or a brick. Some believe that Maggie was the Ripper's first victim, although there was a 3-month gap between this and the next discovery in January 1911, a year in which the killings would become far more frequent. 35-year-old Rosa Trice was found less than 100 yards from her home in Pittsburgh on Sunday the 22nd of January, near the Southern Railroad tracks. It was believed that she had been dragged there just a short distance away from where she had been murdered. Her skull had been crushed, but Rosa had also been stabbed in the jaw, and her throat had been slit to the point where she was nearly decapitated. Man, it's feeling very Jack the Ripper, isn't it? Her unidentified husband was initially arrested for the murder, but was swiftly released due to a lack of evidence. I mean, it's always the husband. You've got to run on that assumption until it's not, when the evidence says no, or like a solid alibi is provided. You know, good police work? Maybe the only good police work in today's episode? Let's find out. A rather different case emerged in early February, in which a woman named Lucinda McNeil was murdered when her throat was cut by her assailant. The difference here being that this murder was actually observed by witnesses who immediately alerted the police, leading to a brief chase in which 2 police officers pursued the killer straight into the hands of another officer waiting nearby. The murderer turned out to be none other than Lucinda's own husband, Charles McNeil, who had returned home drunk from the pub and engaged in an argument with his wife, which ended with him pulling out a razor. Yes, well, there we go. It's always the husband. Especially when the evidence confirms it. He was convicted of her murder, but there was no suggestion that he had ever been involved in any previous criminal activity. Wait, did he plead guilty, or was he not guilty? Could this be a Ripper victim? I don't know. However, a trio of further unsolved murders were to follow. A female body, discovered in February, was sadly never identified. It was found in the woods, surrounded by beer bottles. Her skull had been crushed with a heavy object in a similar way to the original victim, Maggie Brooks, but there was no sign of cuts to the throat that had been inflicted on the other victims. There was another significant gap of 3 months before a woman named Rosa Rivers was found dead on Randolph Street in the Old Fourth Ward in May, although she had been killed from a gunshot wound, so it may seem unlikely that her death was connected to the others. This was followed by the discovery of the body of Belle Walker, who was found in the early hours of Sunday the 28th of May. Just like Maggie Brooke, Belle was a cook, and would have been making her way home from work on the Saturday evening when she was attacked. She was found with a slit throat by her sister, who had gone looking for Belle when she failed to return home. Now, there are certain similarities within some of these early cases, but there's one significant similarity between all of them. All of the victims were described as black women. Oh my god, no! Oh, it was race-related. What a shocker there, Danny. Actually, that's not quite true. Oh. Okay, well, let's see where that goes. Back in those days, the press used a different, outdated term. Oh. Right, yes, which was not considered remotely offensive back in the day, but I'll hope you'll forgive us for replacing this term whenever we quote from the papers. Yeah, thanks, Danny. Appreciate that. Definitely appreciate that. Not that the local press had too much to say about any of these murders. At best, these stories were relegated to a few lines on the back pages, with the most significant example relating to the most recent murder of Belle Walker, which generated an entire brief paragraph under our edited headline of "Black Woman Killed. No Clue to Slayer." There was certainly no connection drawn between any of the murders aside from the witness case of Lucinda McNeil, in which case the suspect practically ran into the hands of an officer. Not much effort seemed to have been made in tracking down the killers, though. The press only began joining some of the dots together following the discovery of the next victim, Addie Watts, on June the 15th. Addie's throat had been cut, and her head had been caved in. I was like, Jesus, okay. With a brick and a heavy railroad coupling pin. Oh, is that something that, joins together to... Oh my god. Before her body was dragged into shrubbery. This time, the Atlanta Journal actually mustered up the motivation to devote a few paragraphs to the murder, under the questioning headline, "Black Butcher at Work?" This was the very first article to speculate over a potential connection between some of the murders that had gone largely ignored until now. The paper reported, quoting, "On account of the number of recent murders of black women, police advance the theory that Atlanta has an insane criminal, something on the order of the famed Jack the Ripper." End quote. I feel like you wouldn't call it, like, insane criminal. Feels like some, I don't know, maybe you would read that in The Sun today. Is the Atlanta, what was it called? The paper? What was the paper? The Atlanta Journal. It sounds like a broadsheet, but that sentence in modern context would read very tabloid. The Atlanta Journal was obviously keen to establish the Black Butcher as the distinctive nickname for this new killer, although it wasn't the one that eventually caught on. Other papers later went with the Southern Jack the Ripper, but it was the Atlanta Ripper that eventually stuck in later years. Incidentally, this concept of giving villainous nicknames to prolific killers really isn't such a great idea. I can imagine that some of these previously anonymous murderers are only likely to get an even bigger perverted thrill when they see their sinister nickname attached to their deeds in the pages of the press, and with a few rare exceptions, it's usually the press to blame for coming up with the names in the first place to heighten the panic and sell more papers. Yeah, I think Danny's made the argument before that, like, wasn't there a serial killer who had a tiny willy? And so we should all just call him Small Willy Jack. It's more fitting. Now, Jack the Ripper may have been one of those rare exceptions. The press initially dubbed him the Whitechapel Murderer and Leather Apron, but an infamous series of letters sent to the Central News Agency changed all of that. Supposedly written and signed by the killer himself, this was the first time we were introduced to the name Jack the Ripper, but the letters are now widely considered to be a hoax, and the press may still have had a hand in coming up with this name too, as there's a strong suspicion that the real author was connected to the industry and was attempting to keep the sensational story alive for quieter news days. Yeah, I mean, as bad as you think the press is today, back in the day they were just like, hey, I mean, if we got no stories, let's make something up. Maybe there had never been a need to think of a new nickname for the Atlanta Ripper anyway, as he may have already adopted one around 20 years earlier. There was certainly more than a few similarities here with the horrors that had stalked Whitechapel in 1888, including the targeting of vulnerable women late at night, the sheer brutality and frequency of the murders, and the use of a blade to slash throats. One newspaper suggested that, just like Jack the Ripper, his over-the-pond successor may have also possessed extensive anatomical knowledge, but I think that's pushing it a bit from what we've heard so far. You surely don't need to have undergone that much medical training to bash a rock over somebody's head and cut their throat. But the more outlandish theories suggest that the Rippers from Whitehall and Atlanta were one and the same. So the idea seems to be that Jack the Ripper took a 20-year holiday from mutilating and killing, during which he moved to Atlanta before eventually resuming his ghastly deeds. Yeah, no. Alternatively, considering the length of time that had passed, maybe this was actually the work of son of Jack the Ripper, or Jack the Ripper Jr., or if I had my way, snotty little jizz-stained Jack. Grim, Danny, grim. Whilst all of this was being debated, albeit in a very low-key manner that still didn't attract very much in the way of column inches, there would only be a wait of 2 weeks before the Atlanta killer once again struck on a Saturday night. But there would be something very significant about this incident. It was the first time that a potential victim had managed to escape an attack, and the first time that a description of the killer could be provided to the police. The survivor's mother would not be so fortunate, though. Oh god, wait. He attempted to kill the daughter and then killed the mother later? What? The exact unfolding of events differs slightly, depending on which newspaper you were reading at the time. Oh god, because they're just like, hey, let's just play fast and loose with the facts. Different newspaper, different story. According to the Atlanta Constitution, 20-year-old Emma Lou Sharp became increasingly concerned as to the whereabouts of her 40-year-old mother, Lena, when she didn't return home from the grocery store on the night of July 1st. Emma Lou was particularly concerned as the fear of the Atlanta Ripper was looming large over the neighborhood. The previous victim from 2 weeks earlier, Addie Watts, had been one of the neighbors of the Sharp family. Unable to find her mother, Emma Lou began walking home when she was apprehended by a tall male stranger in a wide-brimmed hat who asked her how she felt this fine evening. Oh wow, so, oh my god, is she going to get attempted murdered on the same night that her mum actually got murdered by the Atlanta Ripper? That. Keen to get away, she walked right past him without responding. Smart move. This prompted the stranger to spin around and reassure her with the words, "Don't worry, I never hurt girls like you," which is not reassuring. But it turns out that he was not a man of his word. He caught up with Emma Lou and stabbed her in the back while laughing like a maniac before scuttling off back into the shadows. Emma Lou's screams attracted the attention of her neighbors, who rushed to the scene to offer help. She thankfully survived the attack, but later on that night it became clear why her mother had not returned from the shops. The body of Lena Sharp was found nearby, in a pool of blood, with her throat cut. A slightly different account was reported on the same day by the Atlanta Journal. In this version, Lena and Emma Lou were walking to the store together. Oh my god, it's so different! Newspapers from the past, come on! And this is what we have for history now. This is what we have to rely on, just half made up. They were walking to the store together when they were both apprehended by the tall stranger in the wide-brimmed hat. He was less chatty in this account. In fact, he didn't say a word. He just struck Lena in the head with a brick and then cut her throat before turning his attention to her daughter. Whilst he did stab Emma Lou a couple of times, her screams again drew help from neighbours, who came to her aid as the killer made a swift exit from the scene. One part of the story that remained the same across both papers was Emma Lou's subsequent description of the killer. She reckons he was a tall, slender, smartly dressed black man with a strong build. Oh, and he had a wide-brimmed hat. Now, admittedly, that's not much to go on, but you never know, Emma Lou's memory of the man might come in handy a bit later on. I'd say it's really useful, actually, because I was here assuming it was a white dude who was just pissed off about, black people existing and was just out there killing them because, piece of murderer. So I'd say it's quite useful that the race has been ID'd. Emma Lou's description of a well-dressed black man might be a bit more helpful than we first thought, because the truth is that, with a few notable exceptions, there weren't that many sharply dressed black men hanging around the poorer neighborhoods of Atlanta in the evenings at the time. One of the notable exceptions would have been a black undertaker who may have been called out late at night and whose profession would have made him one of the snazziest dressers in town, regardless of color. I suppose you could also speculate that an undertaker wouldn't have a problem in handling dead bodies. Perhaps he was just trying to drum up a bit more business for himself. That is grim. And now he was deflecting any suspicion by offering up a reward and painting himself as the concerned citizen. This was all just panicked speculation, though. As far as we know, LL Lee was never considered a suspect, and he just wanted the killer caught. Is the reason Danny introduced us to the rich guy in the beginning, the first Atlanta millionaire black dude? Because he would be snazzily dressed, right? He's a millionaire. Is that why Danny introduced him? Is that why Danny said the person was staring us in the face? That's a wild speculation at this point, and the two things might not be at all related. But, I don't know, it could be foreshadowing, right? But now everyone was looking to the following Saturday night with dread. The Atlanta Journal even ran a short piece towards the end of the week under the headline, "Will Jack the Ripper claim 8th victim this Saturday?" The paper still seemed happy to call him Jack at this point. As for the numbering of the potential 8th victim, that depends on the arguable point of who we're including and excluding from the list of recent murders that may have been carried out by the same hand, a point which the newspapers could never agree on. Let me guess, they trended higher, though. Because higher sells more papers, and that's what newspapers care about, apparently especially back in the day. The piece did include an alarming quote from a police officer who was not named, and if we're honest, probably didn't exist. Quote, "It's coming. The black man will kill a woman before midnight Saturday." It's a bit on the nose, isn't it? So, did the Atlanta Journal's disturbing prediction turn out to be right? Well, almost. By the sounds of it, he certainly had a go, but thankfully, he messed it up again. On the night of Saturday the 8th, a 22-year-old cook named Mary Yeddle was leaving her place of work at the Salsa household to head back home. She had not got very far and was approaching an alleyway when she heard an eerie whistling noise coming from the other end. She later described the man who suddenly approached her at pace with a revolver in his hand. He was apparently a black man, tall and well-built, who moved with a cat-like tread. Mary obviously wasn't able to check out his dope threads in the darkness. But the good news is that her employer, William Seltzer, had her back. Mary managed to leg it all the way back to the house, and Seltzer came flying out with a gun to confront the whistling man in the alleyway. Seltzer briefly spotted the man and pointed the gun at him, whilst demanding that he raise his hands. But the whistling intruder slunk back into the shadows. By the time the police arrived on the scene, there was no trace of him. "Oh, dude, you could have at least shoot him in the leg or something. Just be like, f him up a little bit." I guess it was the past. That probably could have killed him. It's like, you shot him in the foot. Well, infection's gonna get him. That was a lucky escape for Mary Yeddle, who evaded the fate of being the third cook on the list of victims. Maybe it was this failure that led the Atlanta Ripper to break his Saturday night cycle and attempt another murder just a couple of days later. The next incident would finally get the Atlanta Ripper on the front pages for the first time, during a period in which there was a flurry of activity, and even the police seemed to be getting their shit together by tracking down a number of credible suspects. But would they allow the most promising lead of all to slip through their fingers? Wait, who's the most promising lead? Serve the servants. So, on the morning of Tuesday, July the 11th, a group of workmen were poised to begin toiling away on a sewer close to Grant Park when one of them spotted a large pool of blood in the road just ahead of them. The group followed the trail of blood to a small gully where they found the body of a young woman named Sadie Holly, who worked at a local laundry. Her head had been smashed with a rock and her throat had been slashed to near decapitation. Rather strangely, her shoes had also been removed, and whilst detectives did find a few footprints in the nearby soil, they petered out after only a short distance. The story made the front page of the Atlanta Constitution the following morning in a piece which again compared the recent killings to the methodical and cunning, that's a quote, work of Jack the Ripper, and urged the city of Atlanta to put up a substantial reward for his capture. Whilst it was good to see that the press finally deemed this monster worthy of a front-page story after about 8 recent murders, the piece in the Constitution did also include this short snippet, which perhaps partly explains why it had taken them so long to take an interest. In the paper's view, quote, "Killing of blacks by blacks are frequent enough on Saturday nights, when blind tiger whiskey has been flowing freely, and if the murders had been of the ordinary kind, even a series of them would have caused little stir among the blacks." This is so racist. It's like, oh, you know what it's like. They just get on the whiskey and start murdering each other. Of course they do. I'll say it again, the past. The police also now seemed spurred into action on the strength of it becoming clear that these were more than just your ordinary murders, which aren't really worth the paperwork. They made no less than 3 arrests in quick succession over the next few days and weeks. Now, very little is known about one of the suspects named John Daniel, and whilst details aren't exactly exhaustive about the other 2, we do at least have a little more information on their cases. 27-year-old labourer Henry Huff was arrested on suspicion of murdering the laundry worker Sadie Holly. A cab driver named Will Williams, fantastic, who calls this? If you've got a kid called, if your surname is Williams, and you've got a kid, would you really call them William? William Williams? Well, William Williams claimed to have given them a ride together on the night that Sadie was murdered. He reckoned that the pair had been arguing throughout the whole ride, and they were still at it, hammer and tongs, when they got out of the cab. I've never heard that before, hammer and tongs, Danny. Just a hop, a skip, and a jump from where Sadie's body was soon to be found. The police found scratches later on Henry Huff's arms, along with blood and dirt on his trousers. Sounds a bit fishy? Yeah, it does to me. Huff was only ever charged with the murder of Sadie Holly, but there apparently wasn't enough evidence to convict him. Although the case went to trial, Henry Huff was acquitted and walked free. Bro. Really? Really? Then there was Todd Henderson. He was a 35-year-old odd-job man who was tall and well-built, and there were at least 3 intriguing elements that pointed to his potential involvement in the murder of Sadie Holly. The police first got on his scent when it was claimed that Henderson was spotted in the company of Sadie in a local drugstore on the night that she was murdered, possibly contradicting the allegations of the cab driver Will Williams, who reckons that he was giving Sadie and Henry Huff a ride at broadly the same time. It was later discovered that Todd Henderson owned a pair of shoes which matched the few footprints found near Sadie's body, and not only that, but he was caught blatantly lying about his movements on that night, and perhaps more importantly, about his shaving habits. Okay? Henderson claimed to the police that it would have been impossible for him to cut Sadie's throat with either a razor or a pocket knife, as he hadn't owned either of these items for well over a year. Yeah, I mean, like, whistle boy, we think you're guilty of shooting this person. How could I have shot them? I don't even own a gun. It's like a pretty weak lie. I mean, I don't actually own a gun, but I mean, if I did, and you could just say you didn't. Shortly after making this claim, the police found, on the very morning Sadie Holly's body was discovered, Todd Henderson had popped into the local barber's to get his razor sharpened. Bruh. And there's more. Maybe much more. The police also seem to suspect that Henderson may have been involved with some of the previous murders, and they invited the survivor Emma Luchon to take a look at his face to see if she might recognize the man who had murdered her mother. It was only when Henderson was instructed by the police to speak in her presence that Emma Luch shrank back and shrieked, "That's the man." However, she immediately followed this up with the slightly less assured statement, "If that's not the right man, I'm badly mistaken." Hedge your bets there a little bit. So this officially only went down as a partial identification. Sounds a bit fishy? Yeah, again, it does to me. Me as well, Danny. But perhaps quite shockingly, in the face of all of this, the charges were dropped before Todd Henderson faced trial, as the evidence was considered to be circumstantial. I mean, fair, it is circumstantial, but it's also like something you should probably go to trial with. Maybe. Let, the courts figure that out, rather than just not. There was one further point which suggested that none of these suspects could really have been the Atlanta Ripper. There was a gap of over 7 weeks before the next victim was found. In this case, the body of 20-year-old Mary Duncan was discovered on August the 31st on railroad tracks just west of Atlanta. Her throat had been slashed, and her shoes had been removed, but the point is that all 3 of those suspects were reportedly still being held in custody when Mary Duncan was murdered. The black community of Atlanta had been paralyzed with fear during the height of the murders, reaching the point when many black women felt no longer safe to go out to work. In fact, Pastor C.M. Tanner from Big Bethel Church appeared to suggest that they only had themselves to blame if they got murdered on the way home from their jobs, declaring, venturing out at night is inviting the monster's ravages. Well, Pastor, how do you suggest they go home? Another pastor, Henry Hugh Proctor of the First Congregational Church in Atlanta, also gave a long, rambling, and occasionally indecipherable sermon, later reproduced in the press, in which he claimed that he could see the hand of God himself in the work of the Ripper, and that his bloody hand points to the sin of black people themselves. Ah, yes, they brought it on themselves by being black. So there's another suspect right there, but there's no evidence of God ever being brought in for questioning. Yet, despite these bizarre messages to their congregations, the pastors between them also did a lot of genuinely productive and helpful work, as did many other leading members of the black community, and that's a good job because there were many times when it seemed as if nobody else in Atlanta gave it. The pastors frequently urged everyone to offer their full cooperation to the police, organized petitions to city officials for more help in tracking down the killer, and followed the lead of the Atlanta Constitution. Oh, the paper, sorry. It's like, why are we talking about the Constitution? By calling for a substantial reward for the Ripper's capture. An official state reward of $250 was offered by the governor of Georgia, Hoke Smith, a man who supported taxes for white and black schools on the grounds that, quote, it is folly to spend the money of white men to give blacks a book education. Wow, dude. The churches felt that this bounty wasn't high enough, though, so they had a whip round to raise their own reward money. And I find this part quite hard to believe, but it was reported in several newspapers that Pastor C.M. Tanner from Big Bethel Church managed to raise $1,200 in one day by simply passing around a basket. That would be a pretty staggering $40,000, or thereabouts, in today's money, which is not bad for a church serving a largely poor community. No, that's an incredible amount of money. But that's what he claimed. We can only presume that Big Bethel Church was quite spectacularly big, or maybe our old millionaire friend Alonzo Herndon was in the congregation at the time. But it was felt that neither the press nor the police seemed to share this deep resolve to catch the Atlanta Ripper. All the local newspapers were owned by white businessmen and contained stories written by exclusively white journalists that were largely tailored to white audiences. And the truth is that they had little interest in reporting on what was presumed during the early days to be individual cases of separate black men killing black women. If the victims had been white, the murders would likely have made front-page news every time rather than getting hidden away in a couple of sentences on the back pages. It was only when the idea of a single killer being responsible for all the ongoing murders that the press finally began to take a bit more notice, and even this was probably just down to the opportunity to make attention-grabbing comparisons to Jack the Ripper. Meanwhile, the Atlanta Police Department faced fierce criticism for the way they were handling the investigation. Yeah, no shit, because you're not doing anything. The Atlanta Constitution wrote a scathing editorial in June 1911 which read, "What is the matter with the Atlanta police that they have not found the criminals themselves and locked themselves securely from further depredation? Is it indifference or incompetence? Is Atlanta in need of a police awakening or of a policing shake-up?" Now, this is more than a little hypocritical of the Constitution, a paper which itself had displayed indifference to the murders leading up to Sadie Holly. Even when the paper did briefly cover the initial murders, it tended to pin the blame on mean whiskey and cocaine that was apparently rife in black neighborhoods. Ah yes, that mean whiskey that makes you a murderer. But it often did feel as if the police investigations lacked any serious coordination. They went through a phase of just randomly arresting black suspects and quickly letting them go again. Even when they did find suspects who seemed plausibly connected to the crimes, as in the cases of Henry Huff and Todd Henderson, they either couldn't find enough evidence to charge them or watched them get acquitted at trial. Black community leaders put pressure on the police to hire more black detectives, as despite encouragement from the pastors, it was felt that potential black witnesses were far less likely to place their trust in all-white detectives. I wonder why. But Atlanta wasn't ready for the idea of armed black police officers and detectives having the authority to question and arrest white suspects. We'd have to wait another 40 years for that. Some have suggested that one of the reasons why the police eventually began to really step up the investigations was partly down to pressure from the newly elected mayor of Atlanta, Cortland Wynn, who felt that this was now beginning to tarnish the reputation of the city. He publicly complained, "Why the police are unable to cope with the situation is more than I can understand." And it may have been partly down to the emerging servant problem. Now that black women were afraid to travel home from work, this was oh no, the police start looking into it because their servants can't show up for work. Oh God, police, come on. It's like, oh no, black people are getting murdered. Ha, let's not do anything. Oh no, the white people are slightly inconvenienced. Let's get on that. This was affecting the wealthy employers who were finding that they no longer had anybody around to deal with their soiled underwear. Well, it was a bit more serious than that, but there was certainly a growing wider problem that was having a big impact on business owners who suddenly had lost their women workers. But perhaps we're being a little harsh on the police. It's true that not an awful lot seemed to be happening before the murder of Sadie Holly. But by June 1911, the police had swung full into action, knocking on the doors of the affected neighborhoods, pursuing every lead and conducting regular evening patrols around the alleyways, railroad tracks, and secluded spots where the killer was most likely to strike again. All right, credit where it's due. Well done. They were, however, facing a rather tough challenge back in the days before fingerprint analysis, DNA profiling, or barely any form of forensic science. And there was never much in the way of physical evidence ever found at the crime scenes. Perhaps the biggest problem of all was the police department's size and lack of resources. Only 200 police officers and a grand total of just 15 detectives were on hand to serve a city with a population of over 155,000. One police chief, Henry Jennings, made a curiously defeatist observation when he explained, quote, "The police department is handicapped, seriously so, by its small size. But even if we had more men, we could not stop crime." Even so, you would think that Mayor Cortland Wynn would have jumped at the external offer of assistance, particularly as he had already expressed his confusion as to why the police weren't managing to cope with the case. But apparently not. Although detectives from... He's like, why would I need police? We already know the answer. It's that wild whiskey, isn't it? Although detectives from numerous other cities offered their help, Mayor Wynn rather huffily turned them all down, explaining that the city's 200 capable officers and 15 keen-witted and experienced detectives were more than capable of handling this on their own. Mate, I'm sorry, but they clearly weren't, were they? Oh, God. Up until now, this declaration didn't appear to hold up. Still, maybe the Atlanta Police Department was about to get help from an unexpected source: the killer himself. The very next murder would lead to an arrest and a trial in which the suspect was happy to sing like a canary. Message in the firebox. So, on the morning of Sunday, October the 21st, the body of Eva Florence was found in a field near a Pittsburgh neighborhood. Her head had been caved in, and she had been stabbed in the throat. It was later reported that shots had been fired at around the same time that she was presumed to have been murdered, late on Saturday night. It admittedly took a while for the police to find a suspect. 10 months, in fact, but when they did, it seemed almost certain that they'd got their man. His name was Lawton Brown, also known as Henry Brown, but we'll stick with Lawton, and it was his own girlfriend who turned him in. She appeared to take her time over this, which explains the lengthy gap between the murder and the arrest. So the police didn't find him. He literally showed up at the doorstep because he got grassed on by his girlfriend. Lawton's now ex-girlfriend, reckoned that her partner frequently used to come home late on Saturday nights with blood splatter all over his clothes, and he would sit in front of the fire to dry out for a bit. You'd think that this might have sparked some inquisitive conversations in the Lawton household, particularly when the news broke the following Sunday morning that the Atlanta Ripper had claimed another victim. Maybe she just assumed at the time that it was just a massive coincidence. Which again, little bit fishy, isn't it? Under police interrogation, Lawton displayed an extensive knowledge of most of the murders linked with the Atlanta Ripper, although he didn't admit to being responsible for any of the deaths that preceded Eva Florence. He did claim to have witnessed 2 of the murders and described them in accurate detail, explaining that he felt too afraid to intervene. But there was one murder he admitted to under questioning, and that was the murder of Eva Florence. Goddamn. Okay. And the police clearly felt that he must have been guilty of much more. They confidently declared to the press that they believed the Atlanta Ripper was now in their custody. Yet when he faced trial in October 1912, Lawton Brown was acquitted of murder. This was partly down to a witness named John Rutherford, who I'm afraid we know nothing about. The press simply described him as a black man, but he testified in court that he had knowledge of how Lawton had been treated during police questioning. Rutherford claimed that Lawton had been strapped to a chair and beaten around the head until he confessed to murdering Eva Florence. How exactly Rutherford would have known this is unclear, as he presumably wasn't present during questioning. And if this was the strategy deployed by the police, you might have expected them to keep on beating Lawton around the head until he confessed to every single one of the murders, which he seemed to be so knowledgeable about. But it seems that Lawton Brown was largely acquitted because he was depicted in court as a mentally unstable fantasist who apparently suffered from hallucinations. He was the kind of guy who would admit to anything you like and boast about outlandish stuff he'd never done in order to get a bit of attention. That's a mistake, dude. It's like, yeah, no, I murdered them all. It's like, well, we're going to strap you to the chair. Good! I deserve it! Look at me! So that's now 3 dodgy suspects that were let back out into the wild, and it seems quite shady to me that this guy was supposedly coming home every Saturday night drenched in bloodstains when another murder had just been committed. I guess we only have his ex-girlfriend's word on that note, though, and she may have had a razor to grind. Indeed. Rewinding back to 1911, and it appeared that the real killer would strike again twice before the year was out. Minnie Wise would be the youngest victim of all, aged just 15. She was found near a trash heap, very close to where previous victims had been found. Her head had been smashed in with a rock, her throat slit, and her right index finger had been sliced off at the joint. Minnie's own husband was briefly suspected of a murder, as it was reported that he was fiercely jealous of the attention his 15-year-old bride received from other men, but he was released without charge. Eugh. The grisliest murder of all took place in November. The body of Mary Putnam was apparently still warm when she was found in a relatively isolated ditch. Yet again, her skull had been crushed and her throat slit, but this time, the killer had also disemboweled his victim and torn out her heart, discarding it next to the body. Fucking hell. I know he's been almost cutting people's heads off, but goddamn. A set of footprints were found next to the body, and bloodhounds were called in to follow the potential scent, but the trail went cold after just 200 yards as the footprints approached the trolley tracks. Mary must have been popular, as it was reported that over 1,000 people viewed her body at the undertaker's. An unnamed detective on the scene didn't seem to have much empathy for the mourners, though. In a shocking statement made to the Atlanta Constitution, he snarled, "We won't get to the bottom of this thing until we get some help from the blacks. These murders are being committed among the lower class of blacks. Ignorant, brutal beasts that know nothing else. Their acquaintances are afraid to talk, but if there was a little money slipped them, we could find out invaluable clues, and I wager we would land the murderers. But we haven't got the expenses." End quote. On that bright note to end the year, we move into waited till he starts talking about the wild whiskey times. We move into 1912, and what may possibly be the final 2 murders committed by the Atlanta Ripper, Pearl Williams and Mary Cates, who were yet again cooks making their way home from work and were yet again found with their throats cut, with Mary also reported to have received a blow to the head. The police felt they had a strong lead in the case of Pearl Williams when a witness claimed that a black man had made an angry visit to her workplace a few days before her murder. The man named Frank Harvey was reportedly outraged that Pearl had changed her mind about marrying him, and he furiously declared that if he couldn't marry Pearl, nobody else would. When the police arrested him, they found him to be in possession of a large knife, and he had bloodstains all over his shirt. Bro is going to go to prison, holy shit. Sounds a bit fishy? Yeah, it does to me. But although Frank Harvey was taken in for questioning, along with a 17-year-old called Edgar, who was suspected of being his accomplice, they were both released without charge. Why didn't you charge him? He seems to be extremely guilty. And following the death of Mary Cates in April, it seemed that the Atlanta Ripper had finally fallen silent. At least for a while, although he wasn't believed to have struck at any point over the next couple of years, it was feared that he was planning a comeback in 1914 after a chilling message was found on a card inside an Atlanta fire alarm call box. Alright. Throughout the month of March, Someone had been pissing about breaking the glass panels of fireboxes and pulling the levers inside to raise a false alarm. On the first two occasions, firefighters arrived on the scene to find that their time had been wasted, pinning the blame on mischievous young kids who should have been busy working in a cotton mill. But on the third occasion, they found a card inside the firebox. It's believed that cards may have also been left in the first two boxes, but they'd blown away in the wind by the time the firefighters arrived on the scene. The author of the note was giving his intention to, quote, begin his work in the city of Atlanta again, and that he was poised to cut throats of all black women found on the streets after a certain hour of the night. The card was signed Jack the Ripper, which suggested that the early theories had been right all along and that the Atlanta Ripper had a history stretching back to Whitechapel in 1888. No, he didn't. He just took his name because he was mega famous. Infamous, sorry. But was this a hoax, an empty threat, or a genuine warning that the Saturday night murders were about to resume once more in Atlanta? I would say it's probably a hoax, but take it with, just to be cautious anyway, because, no harm in being a little bit extra cautious. Well, a problem here is that it's debatable when exactly the Atlanta Ripper murders began and when they were over for good. And it might be helpful to dig deeper into the patterns of the killings and figure out just how many Atlanta Rippers we might be chasing. Clinging to a thread. We know that the earlier murders were considered to be entirely unconnected, or, to be more accurate, nobody had bothered to make any kind of connection. It wasn't until the murder of Addie Watts, arguably the seventh victim, that people became drawn to the idea that a single killer was at loose in Atlanta. This was an idea publicly supported by the Fulton County coroner Paul Dunhu, who held inquests on many of the victims. Incidentally, Paul Dunhu had been totally blind since the age of 5 and never obtained a formal medical degree. Okay, but he's the county coroner. They're just choosing to be like, yeah, that guy will do. Yo, mate, you know how to use a knife and cut open a body? You're like, yes. Congratulations, Mr. Coroner. This obviously made the inspection of bodies a bit more challenging than the usual, but he relied on help from his team to provide visual descriptions. And he must have known what he was doing, as he held the position of Fulton County Coroner for 32 years, until his death in 1940. Paul Dunhu, along with press, the police, and most of Atlanta at the time, was convinced that all the unsolved murders were being committed by the same man. So if that was the case, can we glean any clues that might help bring us closer to the man's identity? Okay, let's get the silly Jack the Ripper theory out of the way first. We don't really need to be honest, Annie. I mean, it's daft. It's true that some of the Atlanta murders bore certain obvious similarities to the Whitechapel murders, but there were more than enough differences to indicate that they were not committed by the same man. Jack the Ripper was known to display almost surgical skill in mutilating his victims with deep, methodical cuts and removing organs with chilling precision in the darkness of deserted alleyways. Whilst one of the Atlanta Ripper's later victims, Mary Putnam, was mutilated in a particularly gruesome manner, this was not typical of his rather more blunt style, which usually involved smashing in the victim's head with a large, heavy object, not something Jack ever did, and slitting the victim's throat. The targets were also very different. Jack the Ripper was known to target women with connections to sex work, whereas the Atlanta Ripper exclusively targeted black women working in domestic jobs. There's actually another specific detail about the Atlantan victims which might be important, but we'll come to that in just a second. Okay. Oh wait, we're never going to find out the answer, are we? I forgot that this one's unsolved. Of course it is, because it's Jack the Ripper. I'm trying to figure it out who it might be, and then I'm like, we're never going to know. Oh no! But let's dismiss the idea of Jack the Ripper returning after a 20-year break to resume his murders across the pond. And the firebox thing was clearly a hoax. The real Jack the Ripper would never have been so careless as to allow the first two cards to blow away in the wind after going to the trouble of raising a false alarm. But what strong connections can we draw from the Atlanta victims we've covered so far? It's true that many of them were murdered in a fairly similar manner, although there were occasional significant differences. Aside from the very rare examples of mutilation, there were also instances when gunshots were heard or a gunshot wound was found on the body. The majority of women were found in similar areas, alleyways, fields, and near railroad tracks, all within the poorer neighborhoods occupied exclusively by black people, but some of the locations were spread across a fairly wide radius. Many of them were murdered on a Saturday night, suggesting a predictable routine had been set in motion by one repeat offender, but many others were murdered on different days of the week. Both Sadie Holly and Mary Duncan were missing their shoes, suggesting the same individual was attempting to forge his own chilling signature, but on only 2 occasions. Well, you're not doing a very good job with a signature then, are you? You're like, oh no, I forgot the shoes again. No one's going to take me seriously as the phantom shoe stealer. But there are a few more intriguing points that connect the women themselves. As we've already touched upon, their line of work and their status seemed strangely specific. At least 5 of them were cooks, whilst others also worked in domestic jobs. None of them were living in abject poverty or wondering where the next meal was going to come from, but none of them were particularly comfortable either. They had all received an education and were now working hard to earn a modest living. Many of the victims were described in the press as being particularly attractive, but here's the other detail that often gets missed today, perhaps partly because the contemporary press were using terms now considered outdated to lump all the victims together in one broad category. Terms that are now considered, outdated. That's a way to put it. Although we don't have intricate details on the profiles of each and every victim, it's believed that at least the majority of the women were actually of mixed race. And so now we're really drilling down into some quite extraordinary specifics in terms of race, looks, status, and job description. And this brings the question up of the killer's race. There's always been a widespread assumption that the killer was black. Certainly every suspect ever arrested was black, although I don't think that particularly says much given the times and the statistics that we looked at earlier. And this again led to further criticism of the investigation, as some felt that it was racist to not consider for a second that the killer might be a white man who hated women of color. That was my first assumption, to be honest. It's obviously a possibility that can't be completely ruled out, but it does seem a tad unlikely. For starters, the only 2 visual descriptions we have from survivors both clearly describe a black man. Yeah, which is why I discounted the idea that he was white. Also, I feel like walking around in primarily black neighborhoods as a white dude at this time, people are going to be like, what's a white dude hanging out? What's he doing there? He also looked shady. He looked like a murderer. But perhaps of more significance is the fact that the murders took place in and around black neighborhoods where the sight of a white man wandering the streets would have been highly unusual. Yeah, there we have it. The killer appeared to slip confidently through the neighborhoods without ruffling any feathers, whereas the sighting of a whiteface would have stuck out like a one-legged monk at a strip joint, particularly during the periods when such neighborhoods were on high alert and on the lookout for anything out of the ordinary. He might not necessarily have been a local resident. There were certainly enough trains running in and out of Atlanta, and he may often have found it easier to blend in with the higher volume of passengers on a Saturday evening. But we can only speculate on such a man's motive. Could he have been a black man who held a deep grudge against attractive biracial women who had received an education in schools founded by white philanthropists? Yeah, I would say getting pretty specific, right? Was he angered by the thought of women of color performing domestic duties for wealthy white people? Then it'd be murdering the white people, wouldn't he? It'd be murdering them. Did he have a general problem with mixed blood? Or did he just really have a bad experience with a cook when he was a child? Well, before we get too bogged down with that line of thinking, we also have to address the obvious alternative theory that despite the conclusions of the coroner, who obviously found strong similarities between the murders as far as he could see, there was more than one killer at work here. Yeah, I think so, right? I don't think he's like, oh no, I forgot the shoes. It's like, one person took the shoes and another person didn't. There were some who felt that an original chain of killings may have later inspired copycat murders by aggrieved husbands who felt that they might be more likely to get away with it, as everyone just would peg the blame on a mysterious unknown ripper. Yeah, I think so, and they were right. A certain Judge Nash Broyles made his findings quite disturbingly clear in 1911 when he was sentencing a black man called Jim Murphy who had been charged with threatening to cut his wife's throat. The topic of the Atlanta Ripper came up during this case, during which the judge declared, "There is no such thing in Atlanta as a Black Jack the Ripper. It is just such cases as these that result in murders of black women. I am satisfied that every one of the several black women slain recently in Atlanta were murdered by a different man. There are at least 1,000 black men in Atlanta today who stand ready to cut the throats of their wives at the slightest provocation." All right then, mate. I know there are 1,000 blacks out there ready to murder their wives. I know it. I can feel it in my white bones. For an encore, he went on to explain that the reason why so many murders were committed on Saturday nights was because this was the night when black men tended to get tanked up. No, he's got that, what was it, the wild whiskey? As opposed to white men, who of course traditionally get tanked up on a Wednesday morning. Incidentally, Jim Murphy was fined $25 for threatening to cut his wife's throat, which was probably quite a lot of money back in the day. In a slightly calmer assessment, a Fulton County grand jury conducted a 2-month study into the cases in early 1912, although not many details on this were ever released, and we were never told how they reached their conclusions. All we have to go on is a couple of brief paragraphs from the Atlanta Constitution, which revealed that the jury had concluded, quote, each murder was committed by a different man. In each case, it was the result of jealousy, following immoral conduct. It can get a bit confusing when we ponder the supposed time frame in which the Atlanta Ripper was meant to be operating. Assuming for now that he wasn't a vampire, and we'll address that point in the sequel video if I remember to write it, you would assume his reign would have to begin at and end at some point, and that we can't just pin the blame on one anonymous figure for every murder in Atlanta for the last 150 years. Can you imagine if that was the case? You'd be like, oh, another Ripper victim. It was like, Chief, it's been 100 years. He'd be like, yeah, but God forbid we actually have to do any work, Sergeant. I have no idea if that's how ranks work in the police. It's a guess, mostly from watching and half remembering Brooklyn Nine-Nine. We started our telling of the story today with the murder of cook Maggie Brooke in October 1910. Some historians would argue that despite the soon-to-be familiar hallmarks of the murder of Maggie Brooke, this is too early on in the timeline, and the Atlanta Ripper's canonical list of victims only begins the following year when the murders became more frequent. Others would argue that the list goes back even further, noting two particular murders of black women in 1909, one of whom was found with her throat cut. Several more unsolved murder cases with black women victims emerged in Atlanta through 1910, although, as these were all shot, they're not usually considered to have any connection with the Ripper. On the other end of the timeline, when were the murders supposed to have stopped? The obvious hoax message, found in the firebox in 1914, may have warned of an imminent return, but there was little sign of it. Whenever a body was found under similar circumstances in later years, right up until the 1920s, there were always folk who piped up that they knew the Ripper would come back one day. They'd go quiet again when the case was swiftly solved and the perpetrator was found to have no previous criminal history. That they know of. That happened quite a lot. Maybe the Atlanta Police Department had upped their game by this point and even hired one or two extra detectives. Or maybe they always deserved a little extra credit than they usually received, at least in some cases. We've already mentioned one early case, that of Lucinda McNeil, in which the killer was identified as her own husband who had no connection whatsoever to the other murders. But in fact, there were plenty of other similar stories during this period. For example, Ida Ferguson was stabbed to death in January 1912, but her jealous boyfriend, Lucky Elliot, was convicted of her murder after the police found his own bloodied knife, which had been carelessly left next to the body. Oh, Lucky. You're not setting yourself up for some luck there, are you, Lucky? The somewhat inappropriately named Lucky Elliot, there we go, did make an appeal to the Supreme Court of Georgia as he felt the evidence was circumstantial. Bruh. Come on now. Really? But he didn't get very far with that, and he spent the rest of his life in prison, where he belongs. 1 month later, the body of 30-year-old Alice Owens had been found in a gully with a cut throat, slashes to her wrists and her back, and a bullet wound to her head. The newspapers were quick to identify Alice as another Ripper victim, until her husband, Charlie Owens, was arrested and convicted of her murder. Yeah, it's another Ripper victim. Look at all the similarities. The throats, that's it. That's it, there weren't that many. It took a little while, as the first trial concluded with a hung jury, but he was sentenced to life imprisonment on the second go-around. Slightly weirdly, none of the newspapers bothered to mention that Alice Owen had been Charlie's wife. But the point is that names such as Ida Ferguson and Alice Owen would surely still have a place on the canonical list of Atlanta Ripper victims today, had their individual killers not been caught at the time. So how many others could be removed from the list had the police got the right man? And is the list of supposed Atlanta Ripper victims far more likely to be a list of unsolved crimes that were totally unrelated, meaning that the police were often hunting a solitary figure that never even existed? Yeah, honestly, I think so. Maybe the thing with the shoes was a double murder. Also could be a copycat. Yeah. A broken frame. Some might find it distasteful to suggest that there was really a surge in black men murdering their own wives and girlfriends in Atlanta in the early 20th century, as it might seem to vindicate the comments of Judge Nash Broyles when he ventured that there were at least 1,000 black men in Atlanta willing to slit their wives' throat at the slightest provocation. You burned the dinner? Feeling like Judge Broyles there is, I don't know, maybe he goes home and he thinks about this. He's like, well, I'd slit my wife's throat in a second if she provoked me. So surely they all must want to do that. Right, boys? But let's not get carried away here, as that was a number clearly pulled out of its bottom. The most widely held consensus today is that the majority of these cases were indeed separate murders carried out by husbands and boyfriends, some of whom were attempting to replicate the methods of the previous murders to shift the blame onto a mystery man who lived in the shadows. In that case, well done. You did it. But that's still not to say there wasn't also one man who committed multiple murders during the most frequent and familiar patterns that were emerging in the middle of 1911. Differing sources usually suggest that a man known as the Atlanta Ripper may have killed between 15 to 21 women in total. Scholars feel it's probably more likely that such a man killed between 3 and 8 victims at the very most, and even that figure may be too high. Despite the perceived similarities in many of these cases, there were also just too many differences to convincingly conclude that one man was responsible for all of them. This is perhaps partly why the killers proved so difficult to catch. There weren't enough strong, predictable patterns to follow. If this theory is along the right lines, then this would put the Atlanta Ripper in broadly the same grotesque category as Jack the Ripper, but far from the deadliest and most prolific serial killer of the era. And it would mean that there were somewhere between 13 to 18 murders carried out by separate individuals over the course of a few years. That's obviously a tragically high figure, but it doesn't come close to supporting Judge Broyles' dodgy mathematics. Besides which, it's still entirely possible that at least some of the murders may have been committed by white men who knew full well that the blame was not likely to fall on them. They're just rolling around being like, I can do crimes. No one's going to prosecute me. Look how white I am. Yes! Whenever I speak like this, I always... it's not like how he sounds, but the Leonardo DiCaprio character from... what's the movie about slavery? I don't remember, but that dude with all the memes. Ultimately, the story of the Atlanta Ripper is not the story of a man at all, but the story of a community whose lives were being shattered by thoroughly brutal murders, whilst almost everyone else turned the other way for far too long. Perhaps many of the later deaths could have been prevented if the press had invested more attention in highlighting the earliest deaths, and if the police had invested more resources into getting a handle on them. Yeah, I mean, as bad as the press was, and we've on the press plenty, it's the police whose job it is to solve murders. Even when the later cases began to receive more attention, it probably didn't help that the coroner, Paul Dunhu, was so adamant that a single killer was at large. This may have led to detectives barking up entirely the wrong trees as they focused on hopelessly hunting for threads that weren't there. And yet at the same time, it was this fresh Jack the Ripper angle that appeared to finally generate attention in the first place. If everyone had continued to believe that there was no connection between these black-on-black murders, the stories may have remained permanently relegated to the back pages of the press and the bottom of the police's priority list. But whilst the tally of murders attributed to one Atlanta Ripper may have been overinflated, it still seems quite likely that one vile monster committed multiple murders during the peak period and was never caught. And whilst his identity remains officially unknown, the prime suspect seems blindingly obvious to me. I mean, we're practically falling over credible suspects in a way. We've got a list including a man covered in blood and dirt who was seen arguing with the victim shortly before her body was found, a man with bloodied shorts and a long knife who was witnessed threatening a victim shortly before the murder, and a man with intimate knowledge of all the murders who made a confession that was dismissed. Yeah, all the people who got dismissed today, or not guilty, or, there wasn't enough evidence to go to trial or all that shit. It's like, yeah, I mean, they're probably murderers, weren't they? There just wasn't enough evidence. He wasn't one dude. But surely the man most likely to be the real Atlanta Ripper is 35-year-old Todd Henderson. Wait, who's he? If you remember, he was the guy who was spotted with Sadie Holly in a drugstore on the night she was murdered, but lied about his movements. He was the guy who owned a pair of shoes that matched the footprints found next to her body. He was the guy who claimed he hadn't owned a razor in over a year, yet was witnessed getting his razor sharpened at the barber's the morning after Sadie was found. Wait, how did that guy not go to prison again? He was the one who prompted the survivor, Emma Lou Sharp, to shriek, "That's the man," down at the police station. This may have only gone down as a partial identification after she followed up with a rather vague statement about how she could be wrong, if it turned out she was wrong, but it was a pretty visceral initial response, which suggested that Sadie might not have been Henderson's first victim. And here's one further point, which I've never seen addressed before anywhere. It's just something that struck me as I was sifting through the admittedly often hazy dates and events. Todd Henderson is often dismissed as a suspect because the murders reportedly resumed while he was still in custody. Yeah, but that could have been someone else, police. But hang on a minute. or rather hang on, about 7 weeks. Leading up to the death of Sadie Holly and the subsequent arrest of Todd Henderson, the murder spree was at its peak frequency, with a new body almost expected to be found every Saturday night. Yet after Henderson was placed in custody, there was nothing for over 7 weeks, the longest gap for quite some time in which we didn't see a murder attributed to the Atlanta killer. Yes, the murders were said to have resumed toward the end of his time in custody, but we already suspect that there was more than one murderer in town. The body of Mary Duncan was the next to be found, and in fact, she was the only victim connected to the Ripper during a relatively quiet 3-month period. Mary's shoes had been removed, which happened once before, but was hardly a typical signature of the Ripper. One far more common aspect of the murders that was noticeably missing in the case of Mary is that her head had not been smashed with a heavy object, indicating that perhaps a different killer was at work here. Or maybe that's not necessarily so, because here's another critical point. Whilst it's usually reported that Henderson was still in custody when Mary Duncan was murdered, I'm not actually convinced that that's true. Mary Duncan was found on the 31st of August 1911. A report from the Atlanta Journal, dated the 1st of September, announced that Todd Henderson had recently been released from custody, but didn't state exactly when. Whilst there may have only been a short window of time, if any, between the release of Henderson and the murder of Mary Duncan, is there not a remote possibility that he killed again just as soon as he released? Yeah, of course there is. It does seem incredibly coincidental that after a 7-week gap, the next murder took place at almost exactly the same time that Henderson walked free. I just find it staggering that the other main suspect in Sadie Holly's murder, Henry Huff, had to face trial on the strength of an argumentative ride with a cab driver and a bit of blood and dirt on his trousers, yet all charges against Todd Henderson were dropped. You know, I wouldn't be too surprised if it turned out that Todd Henderson owned a wide-brimmed hat as well. Yeah, Todd Henderson's definitely guilty of some shit. I would say allegedly in my opinion, but he's dead. He's long dead. Still, whilst he might fly high on the list of potential suspects, there was very probably a lot more going on here than just the evil deeds of one man. And the sobering reason why the real Atlanta Ripper will never be definitively identified is because it's pretty hard to make a solid identification on a man with quite so many faces. And that's where the episode ends. I agree. Todd Henderson was a particularly bad dude, probably murdered more than one person. The other people were killed by other people. Bada bing, bada boom. That's it. That's a wrap. Thanks for being here.